A war averted or just delayed? Donald Trump pulled back on striking Iran, but Tehran calls new U.S. sanctions a permanent end to diplomacy. I'm Imran Gavda, and today's newsmaker is the hostilities between America and Iran. Neither side wants nuclear annihilation, but one has to ask, what is the U.S. and Iran's endgame? Americans are wary of another quagmire like Afghanistan and Iraq, and Iran's military might hasn't been put into full force since the 1980s. A war between these two countries would see a staggering loss of life. And the economic impact? Well, neither Washington nor Tehran can afford to waste billions of dollars right now. But here we are, with Donald Trump issuing and then cancelling strikes on Iran, and Hassan Rouhani calling the White House idiotic, all after a recent U.S. request for talks was followed up with sanctions against Iran's supreme leader. Well, let's get straight into the debate with our panel of guests. In Los Angeles is Iranian activist Roxane Ganji. Her father served as Iran's Minister of Education under the last Shah before his ouster in 1979. From Washington, we're joined by Mary Kaczynski. She's the Deputy Director of Policy at Plowshares Fund, an organization committed to denuclearization. And in Tehran is Setara Sadeghi. She's an American Studies PhD student at the University of Tehran. Good to have you all on the program. Roxane, let me start with you. Do you support the new sanctions?
Yes, I definitely do. I think it was long overdue, and I totally support it. I'm totally against war. I think the sanctions were long overdue since the 2009 Green Movement. If the Obama administration had supported back then the grassroots movement of the people of Iran, I think this regime would have not been in place today, and we wouldn't be talking about sanctions. But unfortunately, they decided during the Obama administration not to stand with the people of Iran and their movement, and instead send them $57 billion, which they've spent on their proxies and on spreading terrorism. So I totally support these sanctions.
Roxane, the argument from the Obama administration and those who supported the nuclear deal was that it brought in Iran from the cold, it allowed for engagement, and it also would help prevent Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon. Now the new sanctions are saying, well, we need sanctions because we want to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But that verifiable deal that Iran wasn't cheating on was already doing that. Do you understand why it seems a little paradoxical from the Trump administration?
Okay. I do understand this point of view, but it's not just the issue of the nuclear issue for the people of Iran. For the past 40 years, the Iranian people have been not looked at. They've been overlooked by the international community. The human rights abuses that go on in Iran every day. I mean, the world knows about this. Okay. Iran is a #1 state sponsor of terrorism, state of terrorism. So, I mean, the people of Iran are done with this regime and its totality.
Understood.
So it doesn't matter if there are going to be nuclear issues. These people are sick and tired of being terrorized by a regime that's holding them hostage
Roxane,
for the past 40 years.
Do you believe that the sanctions don't hurt the people?
I have a talk show on Channel 1 TV here in Los Angeles, and I'm in constant contact with a lot of the youth in Iran. I can't say a majority of the youth, but I can get a good vibe. The people of Iran are willing to go through a hardship period if they know that it's going to be the downfall of this regime.
Setara, are you willing to go through hardship if it means the downfall of your government, according to what Roxane said? The sanctions might pinch and might hurt, but it's worth it. That's what she said. What do you think?
Of course not. And I don't think it's, I mean, it's absolutely against human rights. And I don't see how someone with Iranian backgrounds can support sanctions on Iranian people, because they think putting pressure on Iranians and making them go through hardship would finally give them some chance of what regime change or whatever the hawkish B team is pursuing in Iran. And it's like double double detrimental for the people, even if, which I do not agree with that, but even if this current government in Iran is not what you favor or what Iranian people support, you are actually putting pressure on Iranian people, and it's like they are being pressured from both sides. Mm-hmm. This is not the way to support the people who, even if they were, like the majority, were against the government, which I don't think is true. This is not the way to support opposition in one country. Sanctions directly affect Iranian people. It has made their lives difficult, and it has not for 40 years changed anything about the Iranian government. It has only made them stronger. Iran has learned its ways to evade sanctions or to develop capabilities within its borders.
Okay.
So how are you going to justify escalated tensions and pressures against Iranian ordinary citizens?
Okay, and it's good to get that perspective from a young Iranian in Tehran. Mary Kaczynski. So Trump said he didn't want to kill 150 Iranians unless it was absolutely necessary. The good news, I guess, is that there was no strike. On the other hand, there are sanctions, signed, sealed, directed at the leadership, and other sanctions that undoubtedly affect the people. Is it worth it, Mary?
It's absolutely not worth it. I think it's really important when we're looking at the results of sanctions to consider the evidence. And the fact is that the sanctions that the Trump administration is imposing on Iran are hurting ordinary Iranians. We hear everyday stories from Iran about food shortages, medical shortages, children who can't get medicine because of what the Trump administration is doing. These sanctions have also failed to change the behavior of the regime. President Trump violated the nuclear deal over a year ago, reimposed nuclear sanctions, even though Iran was complying with the nuclear deal, and then piled on a lot of other sanctions. What we're seeing now is Iran is actually taking steps away from the nuclear deal. So those sanctions, not only were they a violation of that bargain and U.S. obligations under the deal, those sanctions were counterproductive. Iran is now taking more dangerous steps as a result of these sanctions. Now, to be very clear, if the Trump administration had focused on sanctions for human rights abusers or support for terrorism, there would be a lot of support for those sanctions. I think all of us would support those kind of sanctions. But because Trump has so unreasonably imposed nuclear sanctions and done it without the support of the international community, it's hurting Iranians, ordinary Iranians, and empowering the Iranian regime.
Roxanne Ganji, Nasrallah Pejmanfar, who's a member of the Iranian parliament, had something to say just after the news of the sanctions, and I'll paraphrase it, it's quite a big quote. He said, the Americans placed a huge hat on our heads once with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, got many benefits from us. They took us to the negotiating table to gain benefits from the start. And then he goes on to say, well, they played us. We will never negotiate with them again. We're hearing this a lot from Iranian politicians. Is that what you want? This clear binary and this clear division between the Americans and the Iranians, which invariably might lead to conflict?
Okay, let me first address Setare. I think if your journalists go on the streets of Iran and talk to the people, you will, and I'm sure you follow, there's plenty of YouTube tapes available of how chanted the people are with this regime, and they want regime change. So that you guys can't cover that up anymore.
I live in Iran.
I mean, we get it on a daily
YouTube
basis. Second of all, the sanctions don't include medicine nor food. So that part is it's not because of the sanctions, and I don't think that's very true. Second of all, the government of Iran has held your people, our people, hostage for 40 years. If somebody wants to be admitted to the hospital, they have to go and get their own medicine before being admitted. They have to pay up front. So, I mean, it's not like the Iranian government was a bed of roses and has provided you guys with everything. The human rights abuses on a daily, they have the highest number of prisoners in their in the political prison. There's, you know, on the streets of Tehran every day, women are being attacked because of the hijab, and now lately it's even been worse. We see it every day. So it's not like we're dealing with everybody's playing the Islamic Republic as this is not the people of Iran. It's the Islamic Republic is not the victim here. The Islamic Republic is the culprit here. For 40 years, it's been doing this to the people. We had a senseless war with Iraq. No Iranian wants a war. The only way that, and if you think that they're going to come to the negotiating table, Khamenei has said over and over again that he's not going to sit with the Americans.
Okay.
And he is the supreme leader, and he's the big
and
honcho
to that point,
decides.
Roxanne, so to that point, it's interesting that Khamenei was added to the sanctions. Now, the man hasn't traveled for 30 years. And fascinatingly enough, Trump.
But the man has a lot of money abroad.
Well, Trump.
He's got
interestingly, I mean,
Trump
actually said, and maybe it might have been a slip of the tongue, or it might be revealing as to his level of education on the subject. He actually said Ayatollah Khomeini is being sanctioned now. I mean, unless he's sanctioning him because he doesn't want him to come back from the dead. I'm assuming he meant Khamenei. I'm assuming he meant Khamenei. But again, here's my point, Roxanne. Why do you need to go to that level? Here's a man who hasn't traveled for 30 years, right? You're showing the Iranian government that you're directly targeting them and their most dear symbols. You think that's not going to lead to war?
What do you mean their most dear symbol? You mean Khamenei is the most dear symbol? I don't think on the streets of Tehran, except for a minority, that Khamenei is the symbol for their revolution. I mean, seriously, please follow what's going on in Iran.
You have no problem with
people of Iran
targeting.
have had it with the Islamic
There's no
Republic.
practical benefit
Khamenei
to targeting
is the head
Khamenei.
of the
Here's the
Islamic
point. There's no practical benefit. If sanctions are the US Treasury sitting down saying we want to choke the Iranians from using money to do bad things, Khamenei, you would accept there's no practical benefit to sanctioning him. So it's symbolic. So why would you do that unless you were itching for a fight, Roxanne?
Well, actually, I think who's itching for the fight is the Islamic Republic. And they've shown that very directly in the Strait of Hormuz. And they're not going to stop. They did this again in the Iran-Iraq war, but this time the people of Iran won't stand for a war.
Good
and
point.
nobody, including myself, no patriotic Iranian wants a war. It doesn't solve anything.
Got it.
The thing that will solve this is to stand with the grassroots movement of the people of Iran and support the Iranians, and keep in mind the territorial integrity of Iran is number one for all of us and our sovereignty.
Let me ask Sitara, hold on, Roxanne. Roxanne, let me ask Sitara. So isn't there a fair point to be made here when we look at Iran in the region? And again, I don't want to treat you as somebody who's a representative of the government or a spokesperson of the government, but might the Iranian government be jeopardizing the lives of its own people by what it does in the region, by what it did allegedly in the Straits of Hormuz, what it does by supporting the Houthis in Yemen, what it does by supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria, what it does in destabilizing Lebanon and Iraq, and so on. That's a part of the conflict that Iran has with the West, because they look at its behavior and you have a bunch of countries saying we need to do something about this. Do you accept that?
What does the U.S. has to do with the region? Why should the U.S. has its troops everywhere in the region and target ordinary citizens and ally itself with the most brutal violators of human rights, for example, in Saudi Arabia or Emirates?
But Iran, for example, so the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia and the Saudis do terrible things. Undoubtedly, check. How about the Iranians support Bashar al-Assad, responsible for 500,000 people dying, and people want to do something about that. Do you accept that?
Mm-hmm. The question should be, what would the region be like if the U.S. was not involved? This is the logical questions to ask. Like you said, I'm an Iranian citizen. I do not necessarily support every decision that my country or the governments of my country is making, and I'm not a spokesperson for them. I do not approve of any violation of human rights anywhere in the world. But this is very hypocritical that the U.S. claims that they are putting pressure on Iran because of violation of human rights, but at the same time, Pompeo meets with Saudi kings and princes, and it does not bring about the murder, the brutal murder of its Washington Post journalists.
Okay.
So this is very hypocritical.
Okay.
And
You
do not,
find it hypocritical.
I mean,
Okay.
Iranian people and people of the world are not going to believe that they are, the U.S. is really concerned about human rights or even terrorism.
Okay.
They have been supporting terrorists in the region for so many years.
Okay.
And by the way, I wanted to add this, that how can you be patriarchal and support violation of the rights of your people? This is like, I find
the
it
rights
very
of my people have been taken
Trump
away by
style.
your government for 40 years.
Okay. She
and
wants
if you're
regime
telling
change.
me the U.S. should not be in the region, what is Iran doing all over the Middle East?
Okay.
What are we doing? Building hospitals
Well,
in
I'm not
places
surprised.
in Iraq
You haven't
and everywhere
traveled to
where
Iran
we don't
probably
have
for 40
hospitals in
years.
Iran. Why are we spending money on the proxies instead of spending
Roxanne,
on the
I'm
poor
talking
people
from
of
Tehran. When
Yes,
was the
I know
last
you're
time you
talking
were
from
in Tehran?
Okay,
Can you
maybe
tell
listen.
me?
You can't say all
I am,
that.
and
I
I'm
can
a
say
Roxanne
young
and Satara.
Iranian.
all that
Roxanne and
needs to be
Satara,
said.
just a second. I want to bring Mary in very finally because I'm out of time.
Okay.
Mary, from the Trump administration's perspective, it's not very predictable what Trump will do. We've seen people like General Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asking for things to calm down a little bit. We see people like John Bolton being bullish and hawkish and saying, let's go and get him, right? Which side is winning right now, in your opinion?
Right now, I think John Bolton and the Iran hawks, the people who want a war, they're winning. And that's because President Trump has been wildly inconsistent. He's creating conditions for war. One day he says, we're going to do military strikes. The next day he says it's only sanctions. And the day after that, it's I want talks with Iran. That's not a strategy. That doesn't lead to a long-term solution. That creates chaos. It creates the potential for conflict. On the other hand, you have John Bolton and others within the administration and within the U.S. who are advocating for military strikes against Iran. And to be very clear, there's no such thing as a precision strike. There's no such thing as sort of a short bombing campaign and then we get out. That's an attack on another country. Bombing another country is an act of war. And while John Bolton is in the White House and Trump is in the White House, that situation becomes more and more dangerous over time. It's very likely that we're going to see a military conflict within the next year and a half if cooler heads don't prevail on both sides.
Okay. Mary, Roxanne, and Satara, I hope to have you all back on the program sometime soon, but I've got to wrap for now. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
The United Nations has condemned itself for what a new report calls an obviously dysfunctional performance, one that led to what the UN says was a genocidal campaign against Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. The UN has long been accused of ignoring several signs that Myanmar's military was going to carry out an operation against the Rohingya in Rakhine State. So, does this admission of failure mean the UN will now be a stronger ally to a population known as the most persecuted minority in the world? Natalie Perhonen takes a look.
These are the people the UN was supposed to protect. They are the Rohingya, one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. In August 2017, more than 700,000 Rohingya fled their homes in Rakhine State in western Myanmar. The mass exodus happened after Myanmar's military launched an operation in retaliation for the deaths of security personnel. The international community watched as thousands of Rohingya died, women were raped, and villages were destroyed. But there were warning signs that the Rohingya were in danger, and a new report found that the UN failed to step in time. The independently commissioned findings show there was a systemic failure of the organization. A major contributor to that problem was a divided approach on how to deal with the country. Myanmar was a burgeoning democracy, coming out of decades of military rule. The nation was being steered by a former Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi.
We have never been soft on human rights in this country. Our government has emerged as a body committed to the defense of human rights.
Some UN agencies and its officers inside the country wanted to pursue quiet diplomacy with Myanmar's leadership, while others wanted to publicly condemn human rights violations. The report found 5 key areas that led to failure: lack of support from UN member countries, absence of a clear and unified strategy in Myanmar, no clear point of coordination, dysfunctional actions at the country team level, and problems of systematic and unified field analysis from Rakhine State. The investigation also found the person appointed to be the main UN representative in Myanmar, the resident coordinator, didn't have the right experience for the role. Reports sent from that person's office back to headquarters at times played down what was happening on the ground in Rakhine State. On top of this, UN Security Council members were divided on how to address the situation. Even the way the UN is structured and its reporting lines have come under scrutiny. It all points to a divided institution. It's a problem the UN has heard before. It had commissioned a report into its actions in Sri Lanka during the civil war and had promised to put human rights at the centre of everything the UN does. The blueprint on how to respond to what was unfolding in Rakhine State in August 2017 was in place, but the lessons of the past were forgotten. So will this second report make a difference, or is the fate of the Rohingya set to be repeated? Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in Vienna is former UN Assistant Secretary General Charles Petrie. He was a UN Development Programme representative for Myanmar, and he wrote the review of the UN's actions during Sri Lanka's civil war. In Yangon is Nyo Aung Myint. He was Aung San Suu Kyi's spokesman and is a former member of Myanmar's ruling National League for Democracy. And joining us in Bangkok is Human Rights Watch's Deputy Director for Asia, Phil Robertson. Good to have you all on the program. Let me start with you, Phil. This UN report, scathing, looking at itself and its own actions, calling it a systemic failure. Was this necessary and accurate?
Well, it was certainly necessary. It should have gone much farther in terms of assigning accountability to individuals and agencies. In some ways, the report, while being very scathing about the system, was a bit of a parody of a UN reform report because ultimately no one is held accountable. Everybody blames the system. Everybody blames a dispute between development and human rights priorities. But at the end of the day, the people who made the mistakes in the field are essentially promoted. And that's what we've seen with the UN resident coordinator who was in charge of Myanmar at the time and now is the UN resident coordinator in India.
Yeah, so we're talking about Renata Lok-Desalegn, who's accused of downplaying concerns about worsening abuses against the Rohingya to further her development agenda. Built in implicitly into the report, and you have people commenting on it. Charles Petrie, when we look at this, has the UN failed because it was trying to balance two impossible things? On the one hand, some arms of the organization trying to hold Myanmar to account for human rights abuses, and we had these reports coming in of massacres and terrible things going on. And on the other hand, other arms of the UN trying to ensure that the country comes in from the cold and develops and becomes a proper player in the international system. Was it impossible to do both at the same time?
Well, the answer to the question is no, but I actually think the report was very good and very hard-hitting and needs to be taken in the context of the review that was done in Sri Lanka, the internal review, that highlighted exactly the same issues. So in a way, I think if you take Gert Rosenthal's report and juxtapose it to the Sri Lanka internal review report that was considered one of the most scathing on the UN, then I think you have a very dramatic conclusion that is to be drawn. I mean, in terms of balancing the development with the human rights, I mean, that's the false dilemma. And I would suggest that focusing on the RC's role is actually to misunderstand the fundamental failing of the UN, which is a systemic failing. And it's the fact that it's been unable to deal with both. There's no reason why the UN can't push a development agenda. There's no reason the UN can't also advocate a human rights agenda. And there's absolutely no reason why the UN can't implement a humanitarian response. When it's done at the level of the field, it becomes impossible because they're mutually exclusive approaches. But when it's done at a very senior level in New York, it is possible. And then it becomes a question of calibration. And that's where the UN failed. The UN failed in Sri Lanka. The UN failed in Myanmar by not having the courage to have a senior UN official responsible for implementing a coherent strategy.
Nyo Aung Mint, fundamentally, it seems, according to the UN, that your government got away with genocide and ethnic cleansing because the UN was asleep at the wheel.
I don't really agree with that because, you know, the UN has a very limited, capability to convince the both parties, like kind of, you know, the Rohingya community as well as the Myanmar government. But of course, when you compare with that in the last 5 years or 6 years in Myanmar, that the previous government, and then the government has been very, you know, very closely working with the UN, and then did more than that when the Cyclone Nuggets at the time, UN played a very big role, and UN, you know, it should be credited to open the country to back
Certainly.
to the.
But no, the UN is saying based on its own review, when they had Guatemalan former Foreign Minister Gert Rosenthal head this commission and they did this review, they're saying they were too nice to Myanmar's government because it didn't deserve the niceness because of what it was doing in Rakhine State at the time.
No, that's a lot of, you know, the exaggeration. So because you cannot find that the very solid, okay, when you have a solid incident in like an Indian village and they have been prosecuted, the wrongdoers, so then the UN, it's doing the best. But, you know, the problem is that only a one-sided and then look like a witch hunt towards the government and military. So
are you disappointed then that the UN is coming out and saying that we weren't hard enough on Myanmar's government and we weren't taking the threat serious enough because you believe that they were biased anyway?
So they just not biased, but that, you know, that's a capacity that what they could do it and what they should have done it, and then, you know, there's going to be a more, you know, independent, you know, the investigation, inquiries, and the conclusion is not yet. That was the very, very beginning of that, the investigation, very beginning of the collaboration between the different parties.
Okay. Phil Robertson, it's interesting because part of the criticism of Renata Lok-Desalegn was that there was a de-dramatizing of events. Would you agree that we're hearing a de-dramatizing of events from Nyo Aung Mint and a different version perhaps of what had happened over the years?
What we're hearing is actually a cover-up. We're hearing a cover-up of crimes against humanity. We're hearing a cover-up of ethnic cleansing. We're hearing a cover-up of possible genocide. You know, he's hewing to the common narrative that we're hearing from the Burmese government that, what are you talking about? Nothing went wrong. The reality is that there have been horrific atrocities in Rakhine State. Right now, we're seeing a blackout of the internet as the Burmese military now goes after the Arakan army, and Rakhine civilians will also be in the way of that. And the Burmese government is again saying, you know, geez, we don't know what's going on, and the military is denying any accountability. The reality is that Burma is refusing to take any accountability for these atrocities that have been documented by the fact-finding mission and many others in excruciating detail. And ultimately, the international community needs to act. We need to see a global arms embargo against the Burmese military, and we need to be seeing sanctions against top government and military leaders in Myanmar until we see accountability. You know, we're seeing these local The International Commission of Inquiry, headed by a former Philippines diplomat, which is going to be another cover-up. You know, it seems that Myanmar has learned one thing from Sri Lanka, which is that if you keep creating sort of national commissions of investigation that really do nothing, it keeps the attention of the international community distracted enough to try to get away with these horrific crimes.
Let's get a response from Nyo. Nyo on Mint.
Well, it's a different perspective. What do you look at it and how you look at it? When you wanted to have it like kind of, someone wanted to, put on that like a trial, you just wanted to create the case. So you already accuse that, you already decide that he was guilty. So you have a suspicious the matter, then you have a like kind of, the creating of that, who is going to, because that's I'm really shocked that, and I'm very stunned that the author killed so many more than 100 Hindus, but the human rights the activists.
Certainly, although Human Rights Watch has reported on that. In addition to that, I don't want to do Phil's job for him here, but they have reported on ARSA's atrocities and the atrocities that are linked to Myanmar's forces and the Buddhist forces, which seem to be far larger than ARSA's atrocities. Nevertheless, I want to bring Charles in here. Charles, we have Antonio Guterres saying, okay, we messed up. I'm taking this report very seriously. This is a serious problem. What happens next? Does the UN, what does it do in the short term to change its approach to what is still an ongoing problem?
Well, I don't think that's what the report was addressing. And so in a way, I think right now we're talking about two different, of course, mutually supported dynamics. The report was looking at the ability of the UN to manage the crisis. And what came out is that the UN has once again failed to manage such a political crisis. And so I think what the Secretary General needs to do in looking at the report is to draw the conclusions of how better to structure the organization, the whole organization, to deal with the future crisis of this magnitude and gravity. Then there's the other issue of what to do with the situation in Myanmar. And that is, again, I think that's outside of the remit of the report. Mm-hmm. The report was very much looking at the UN's ability to manage a political crisis of this magnitude, and demonstrated that the UN failed the same way it failed in Sri Lanka.
But if we break this down, Charles, right? If we break this down and we say that what defines it as a crisis is that hundreds of thousands of people were on the move crossing over into a neighboring country, Bangladesh. What also defines it as a crisis is that thousands of people were killed and hundreds of homes, possibly thousands of homes, were burned to the ground. Yeah. If the UN is saying we failed to prevent this crisis or manage this crisis, it's also saying at the same time, and I don't want to put words into the report's mouth, but isn't it also saying we failed to prevent it and we failed to put it out while it was happening? Am I right?
Yeah, during the period of the report, yeah, it's exactly that, yeah. But it's not saying anything about what needs to be done now.
I see.
I mean, see, my point is that the Sri Lanka was a major failing of the organization, a systemic failing. Very clear lessons were spelt out following Sri Lanka, and the Secretary General of the time committed to implementing them. Right. A little bit later, or a little while later, we have the Myanmar Rohingya crisis, and one sees that none of the lessons were learned.
Understood.
That there were, but the big difference between Sri Lanka and Myanmar is that in Sri Lanka the UN was central to the response. Mm-hmm. There was no other organization that had. In Myanmar, the UN was not central to the response. It was one of the players, but not the key player.
Okay.
And for me, the drama and the tragedy for the UN, if it doesn't seriously take both these reports in account and implements the recommendations, is that the UN is increasingly become marginal and irrelevant in such contexts.
Understood.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask Phil Robertson about the internet blackout in Rakhine State. I want to circle back to that point that you made because, yes, it's not related to the Rohingya. You have an insurgency with the AA insurgents or the Arakan army, not to be confused with ARSA. This is a Buddhist nationalist army. So you have a situation there, and they've cut the internet. Now we've got the UN Special Rapporteur coming out and criticizing the blackout, saying this is a clearance operation, or is providing cover for a clearance operation, and it could be or can be a cover for committing gross human rights violations against the civilian population. And I wonder, Phil, after this report has come out, are we seeing the UN maybe up the ante a little bit in its condemnation as a result of this report that came out, or am I maybe reading too much into it?
Well, I mean, I think we have seen an increasingly hard line from the acting UN resident coordinator, Knut Odsby, saying that, they were not going to comply with Myanmar's idea that they could just say that these internal displaced persons camps in central Rakhine State housing the Rohingya would be there permanently, and that the international community would just provide there indefinitely. They said that this is looking like a situation of apartheid, and we're not going to support that. But the problem is that no one has been held accountable within the Myanmar security forces for the violence that has taken place against the Rohingya in 2012, in 2016, in 2017. And unfortunately, no one's being held accountable for the violence that's now being perpetrated against the Buddhist Rakhine civilians who are caught in this violence as the Tatmadaw tries to chase down the Arakan army. It's important to recognize that this is a systematically rights-abusing army. The way they operate is targeting civilians. And if you talk to the Kachin people in the north, or the Karen people in the east, or the Mon people in the southeast, they will tell you the same thing, that they have had the same experience with this army. And unfortunately, the civilian government and its spokespeople are covering up for the violence and the abuses and the rights violations that are being perpetrated by the Burmese army against their own people. And that is unacceptable and has to change. And the UN, with its Human Rights Upfront project, which was one of the key issues that came out of the very important report that Charles wrote about the debacle in Sri Lanka, the Human Rights Upfront approach in Myanmar failed. And now they have to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, how are we going to make this work in a real way in a troubled country like Myanmar or other troubled countries in other parts of the world?
Phil Robertson, Nyo Aung Myint, and Charles Petrie, good to have you on the program. I've got to wrap, but I thank you again.
My first duty as sea captain, the first duty of every sea captain, is to rescue lives in sea distress. That I could get dragged to court for this, it simply cannot be.
Italian prosecutors say Captain Pia Klemp isn't a hero but a criminal. They argue she didn't rescue migrants at sea but collaborated with people smugglers, a crime that could put her in jail for 20 years. But activists say the charges against her are political. They point to Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini's crackdown on immigration, which also barred 2 rescue ships from docking in Italy's ports. More than 23,000 migrants came to Italy in 2018. That's more than anywhere else in the European Union. Joining me now to discuss this from Rovereto, Italy, is Pia Klemp's lawyer, Nicola Canestrini, and in Brussels, European Parliament member Marco Campomignosi. From Italy's La Lega party. He was the parliamentary assistant to Matteo Salvini. Good to have you both on the program. Marco, let me start with you. So when we look at this from the outside in, these are volunteers who essentially want to stop people from drowning, and they want to help save lives, yet you want to throw them in jail or fine them tens of thousands of euros. It's very harsh. Why?
In Italy, we have a division of powers, so we politicians don't make statements on what judges are called to decide on. So what we may say in this situation is that what Salvini is doing is to send messages also to the people who wants to migrate to Italy, to Europe, is that they have to follow legal ways to enter in our country, to enter in the European Union. Italy has been left alone by the European authorities in order to face this phenomenon. And what Salvini is doing is also the only way to save lives, because to stop smugglers means to stop deaths.
Okay,
Because
but Marco, you're telling me there's a division of powers. I can understand the justification. Yes. You're saying Italy has been left alone to deal with this. The other European nations talk big, but it's Italy and Greece and other countries that have to deal with the brunt of it. Fine. But on the other hand, you're telling me there's nothing that Salvini says or does that influences the courts. Which one is it?
No, of course. Our government has proposed new rules in order to make a clear distinction between who is making a sort of abatement of smugglers' activity from who is really working on solidarity. Because a boat starting from the African coast with the aim to make a sort to call the Italian authorities in order to ask them to make them enter into an Italian port is something we cannot accept.
Okay.
Because there are Libyan authorities with which we are working very well, and because there are Italian authorities who should take care of that, not ONGs which
okay.
are working in a way which is not clear in some cases. This has happened also before the government.
Okay, so let me get a response from Nicola.
Because the case, for example, of a Scot.
Right, hold on for a second. So we're going to talk about Luventa, we're going to talk about Sea-Watch, we're going to look at these different cases. But broadly speaking, Nicola, the approach from the government is that these are not volunteers, these are not rescuers, they are aiders and abettors of smugglers and human traffickers. Your response to that?
Yes, I look forward to see how they can prove this before an Italian court, because you see, it's very easy to criminalize people with a tweet or with a Facebook post. But in the courtroom, things are different, and it will turn out that there is no evidence in saying that those volunteers, which we should be grateful to because they helped to clean our coastlines, what happened there in the Mediterranean Sea. So it will turn out that they are acting out of solidarity. And I ask you, if there is an ambulance nearby the people that are going to be hurt or that need some help, is the ambulance helping people to save their lives, or are they helping the people who want to hurt each other? So of course the NGOs are there, exactly there where they needed to be, exactly there where people are dying in the sea.
Right. Nicola, let me ask you just for a second here. So, because yes, there are those people with really good intentions who want to make sure that people don't die. On the other hand, there are smugglers, people who manipulate poor people who are fleeing Libya or Tunisia or wherever. They take their money, they risk those people's lives, they collect their dollars, they chuck them on the boats and they say bye-bye and they're on to their next customers, right? Whether this is by intention or not, do you agree that these smugglers are being strengthened and emboldened?
The fact is that human trafficking is a very huge crime under international law and under Italian law, but it's very difficult to caught the real traffickers. So my impression is, but I'm speaking not as a criminal lawyer here, but as an Italian European citizen, it's very easy to point out if there is some small NGO to criminalize, and it's very difficult to get the real smugglers and traffickers, because you see, they don't, it would be very helpful for everybody if Italian government and European government, they could have some help from Libya. Let me say that. Libya gets our money, but does not stop the traffickers to operate.
Okay, so let's get a response. So, Marco, if you want to solve the root causes, help solve the situation in Libya rather than punish the people who are just trying to save lives, no more, no less.
Yes, but Italy is helping Libya in order to have instruments in order to block these smugglers' activities. And this is very important because the less smugglers' activity is on, the less people will be treated and asked by these persons in order to have their money, in order to make their risks, take those risks, and so on. So what we may say is that also, in some countries, they would like to have, in some parties in Italy, they would like to have a redistribution of immigrants, but automatic system of redistribution of immigrants in other European countries.
Certainly.
But this is something impossible.
And that's something you discuss in Brussels.
In the past.
Certainly, you're a member of the European Parliament. That's something you discuss in Brussels. But on the ground, right? Okay, to give you an example of Sea-Watch. So we've had Luventa impounded. We have the Dutch-flagged German boat Sea-Watch, which just drifts and floats around. 43 migrants are on it. Have your policy, but why not let them dock in Lampedusa? Then you can decide, fine, if it's your policy not to give them asylum, that's okay, but why let them float in the sea and risk their lives?
Their lives are not at risk because our authorities are checking the situation every moment. Second, we want to send a message to the Dutch and German states. They need to know very well that these associations from Germany, these boats with Dutch flag, they cannot enter in Italy. We need to stop this because it's not safe for immigrants. It's not good for legal immigrants we already have in Italy because these people will increase the downward competition on wages,
so I want to pose that to Nicola.
And blocking this.
Okay, so I want to pose it to Nicola. So Nicola, the message is... go ahead, Marco, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that this is a message to the other associations who want to make this kind of activities. This is not anymore possible.
But Marco, if people die, is it worth the message?
To help immigrants.
If people die, is it worth saying, well, you know, those people died, so there's a message for you, Mr. Macron, Miss Merkel. Those people died and it's your fault. Is that what you want to do?
No, but the situation is monitored by the Italian authorities. The problem is that in the past, some of these ONGs did not follow the suggestions and the orders of the Libyan or Italian authorities. This has been a big problem. In this case, the Italian authorities are saying you cannot enter. They knew since the first moment that they could not have this. Italy is trying to involve all the other countries, but we know very well that the other European countries don't care about this situation. So they leave Italy alone facing this situation, and this is something we cannot accept.
Nicola, as uncomfortable as this might be for you, is it true that this is a popular policy that this new government is proposing, and this is what the Italian people want?
Yes. But I'm used to compare things to right or not right, not to how many people are saying that somebody should be done. Because you see, defending fundamental rights is mostly unpopular, but we have to do it. But let me say two more things to what I already heard. You stated, the parliament member of the Lega stated that they want to send a message. That's exactly putting the message over the people's lives. Because we have tortured people there, people with post-traumatic stress disorder, and they need to have medical assistance. They are in right to ask for asylum. Nobody can prevent them under the Geneva Convention to file their asylum request. Then Italian authorities have to decide, probably not in 2 years or in 3 years, that's how long it takes in Italy to examine the asylum request, but in some months if they have the right to stay or not. But nothing can prevent them to have medical care, humanitarian assistance, which is clearly stated by international laws and by EU rulings, and they need a place of safety. Is somebody forgetting that Italy has been convicted by the European Court of Human Rights in 2012 in the Hirsi case? Because the European Court of Human Rights said that we cannot send people back to Libya because it's not a safe place. There is a violation of Article 3 against Italy, which was a state which had a great tradition of defending fundamental rights. Where are we now? Where are we now? We are letting people draw because we want to send a message. Right. And I asked the politician, where was Mr. Salvini when you discussed the Dublin Agreement, the fact that the Dublin Agreement has to be revised now? He missed the meetings, 5 out of 6 of them. He didn't go there.
Okay,
is he thinking to change the EU
policy?
Okay,
so that's a good question. That's a good question. Marco, answer that for us and then I'll wrap because I'm out of time. Marco, where was Salvini? You want to change the situation, but he didn't show up for the meetings.
No, but this is not true. The Italian government is represented every time there are these meetings of interior ministers in Luxembourg. This is an issue proposed by some leftists in Italy. No, Salvini is doing his job very well. One big important part of his job is to stay between our citizens, to listen to them. So he's doing his job every day. The fact is that the most of these people coming to Italy from the Northern Africa are not are economic migrants. So the 80% of these people finally, when they are in our country, are not recognized as asylum seekers.
Okay.
Humanitarian assistance have been provided by Italy every time, especially to women, children, absolutely. Every time Italy has continued to assist these people entering in our country. We are only introducing something which Australia is doing since a lot of years. Now people know that it's very difficult to enter in Australia using this kind of ways. This is the fact.
Okay, it's also worth noting that once you're dead at the bottom of the sea, it doesn't matter whether you were labeled an economic migrant or a refugee, you still drowned at sea. Marco and Nicola, I'm out of time, but it's been good to talk to you. Marco Campomagnosi and Nicola Canestrini. Thanks for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Jared Kushner unveils part of his plan to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But does throwing $50 billion at the problem have any chance of success? Until then, thank you for watching. Goodbye.